So tell us about this new show.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's called The Alienist. It's based on a book by Caleb Carr called The Alienist, and it's set in 1896 New York City.
Well, I'm playing the alienist. It was a term used for psychologists back in the days. And yeah, I'm a guy who is desperately trying to find this very vicious serial killer.
Earlier, Dakota and she was explaining an alienist is a psychologist.
Yeah, it was an old-fashioned term for a psychologist, and that's a big part of the show, is sort of the birth of psychology and the birth of behavioral analysis in finding a
really
serial killer. Yeah, exactly.
That's what's so endearing in this story. It's that it is the beginning of so many sciences, of so many new things.
We are looking for at least one thing: coherence, within and without. Something that will put our lives together on the inside so that we don't live with this dissonance and disconnect within our own thinking. And hopefully in the diversity of people and cultures and ethnicities, we can learn to live peaceably with each other. Starting in the 1970s, Daniel Yankelevich, the social theorist, said this: culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. Culture is an effort to provide a coherent set of answers to the existential situations that confront all human beings in the passage of their lives. But a genuine cultural revolution then is one that makes a decisive break with the shared meanings of the past, particularly those which relate to the deepest questions of the purpose and nature of human life.
Police say the young gunman in Kentucky opened fire on classmates inside the school. 14 people were shot this morning. At least 2 of them died.
Bryson Conkright found himself right next to the shooter. His right hand was grazed by a bullet. When he came in, did he say anything? Did you hear?
He was lifeless. He just pulled out the gun, didn't think twice, and just did it.
This isn't just the 11th American school shooting since January 1st. It's also the 50th this academic school year.
I think we've become desensitized to these school shootings. They happen far more often, and as a result, I think people just aren't as horrified.
Over the years, a steady stream of gunfire in cities now known by just their first name.
School shooting. Shooting in a school.
Another school shooting.
From Columbine to Blacksburg, Marysville, Washington, Roseburg, Oregon, and Rancho Tehama Reserve, California.
It used to be if there was any school shooting, it was the lead story for days, and people would be obsessed. How did this happen?
We no longer are able to dig deep enough to have the proper response to the misery with which we are living. Why present all of this at the beginning of a talk? It is because, ladies and gentlemen, we had dreamed somehow from the Romantic poets that man was being born again, that the 20th century would usher in some kind of a utopia, that all of the ambassadors in the United Nations would get together, and the more capacity we had to communicate, the greater the prospect of peace there would be. Instead, even in the last 24 hours, scientists have moved the clock one more point closer to
the so-called doomsday clock is now 30 seconds closer to midnight.
It's supposed to be a measure of how well the world is functioning as a whole, but scientists say it hasn't been going so well lately.
It is 2 minutes to midnight.
A move in the wrong direction.
The most ominous setting, apparently, since 1953.
So we moved to the next mood that came around, and that was pluralization. Pluralization is where the sociologists tell us is a competing number of worldviews that are available to its members, and no worldview is ultimately dominant. A competing number of worldviews available to its members, and no worldview is ultimately dominant. What happens when that takes place? You may come from a different culture to me. And so we see values that come from completely different backgrounds. We think only of the problem of racism. The problem of racism is symptomatic of value differences that come within the heart even of cultural and ethnic differences. Pluralization has a problem where we really don't have the ability to arrive at how to get along with each other. The confusion that comes, and that's what's really happened in Hollywood today, hasn't it? They have a right to complain of the exploitation of people for the sake of progress in society, but often the entertainment world itself exploits people and comes into your life and mine through the back door of the imagination rather than the front door of reason. A pluralized culture is a privileged culture, but a pluralized culture that lives in tension within itself without finding the answers again for moral reasoning is truly a very dangerous culture. And so we end up living with systemic and systematic contradiction. Notice these moods, as Peter Berker would say, are good things. Secularization, pluralization, but secularization can lead to no shame when there's no transcendent ethic. Pluralization moves into tension points where we try to learn how to even get along with each other, and we find out it is nowhere near as easy. It is not so much a question of race as it is a question of values. The values that we hold shape what you and I are. Values come out of convictions. Foods and colors come out of opinions. You can change your opinion with time, but you cannot change your conviction without changing who you are. And so pluralization has a wonderful privilege of living together with other people, but what is the worldview that is going to be dominant if we in the West are to survive?
And now Helinski's going to have his term. And for Tyler Helinski, the 21-year-old redshirt sophomore quarterback at Washington State, his time had arrived.
Helinski lobs it. Caught. Touchdown.
He started for the Cougars in last month's Holiday Bowl because of an injury to the starting quarterback. And the job would be his next year.
Yeah, we're all shocked. We're still all trying to process it.
The stunning news, Daryl Thomas said, still hasn't really sunk in. This 21-year-old quarterback, who set all kinds of passing records at Upland High School, was found dead at his Pullman apartment just off the campus of Washington State University. A rifle recovered next to his body, and there was a suicide note. And Pullman police are saying, for now, this is listed as a suicide. When you heard the news, you said, no, this can't be right.
Exactly.
So there you go. And the question today that puzzles everyone who knows him or knows of his story, how could this be?
Suicide is very complicated, and so I wish there was a kind of one-size-fits-all.
Meaning. A while back, I was on a university campus in Chicago, and on the way into the event, we had these whiteboards with different questions, and one of our questions was, what is the meaning of life? And across the top, we had different options: personal success, to find love, no meaning, to pass on your genes, to have power and influence, to achieve your goals. And students would confidently walk up to this board, and they would take the marker, and then they would stand there, and they would stare at it, sometimes for minutes on end, just paralyzed. Many of them had no idea how to answer that question. And I could hear the Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl in my head. People have enough to live by, but nothing to live for.
I was working in the hotel industry. That's what I was preparing for in a career in the future, the hospitality world. And I would leave the hotel at about 2 in the morning, and I would see things happening there night after night, late hours, and it was a shock to my system to find out how many customers sitting by the bar room at 11 or 11:30 at night would start talking about how lonely and desperate their living really was, how desperate they were in trying to find hope and meaning. See, secularization breaks down shame. Pluralization breaks down reason. It leads me to my final thought. So what are we told in the West? Privatization. As Peter Berger reminds us again, that your religious life, your religious convictions, your spiritual convictions should be kept in private and never brought into the public sphere. And that's exactly where life breaks down and life becomes empty and meaningless, when your values are to be told you must keep them in private, but don't bring them into the public arena. We are living this fragmented, disjointed existence. What is the greatest struggle that we really have? The greatest struggle we have in life, if I understand you as a typical university student, and that I have, is in the search for meaning. Where are we going to find meaning in life? We have to start off by giving a definition. Who are we? Viktor Frankl says this in one of his books: if we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him when we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and environment. We feed the nihilism to which modern man is prone.
What does it mean for something to have meaning? Does this collection of letters have meaning? Well, it depends on whether someone put these letters side by side intentionally in order to communicate something, or whether it's just a random collection of letters. Meaning relies on intelligence and intentionality. Randomness is the enemy of meaning. Even if something appears to have meaning, it might not if it's not intentional. Even if something looks meaningful, it is only actually meaningful if it is the result of the intention of an intelligent being. Was our universe intended? Over the last 35 years, what's called the fine-tuning argument has strongly suggested that it was. Here's how. The universe we live in could have taken many different forms. And scientists have approached a consensus, not just Christian scientists, but scientists in general, that there are dozens of fundamental features of the universe that needed to be precisely the way they are for life to be possible. Not just life as we know it, not just life on the planet Earth, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. Take just one example. The explosive force of the initial expansion of the universe for life to be possible had to be within 1 part in 10 to the 60th of what it actually was. In other words, the percentage difference you could have while still accommodating life is a 0 followed by a period followed by 57 zeros followed by a 1. If the initial expansion had been just the slightest bit weaker, gravity would have made the universe collapse back in on itself almost immediately. far too quickly for any form of life to develop. If the initial expansion had been just the slightest bit stronger, particles would have dispersed literally into thin air. They would have dispersed so quickly and wound up so far from each other that all we could have got would have been cold, simple molecules, nothing like the sort of complex chemistry required for any form of life. Sir Roger Penrose, emeritus professor at Oxford, one of the world's leading mathematical physicists, he estimates that the overall difference you could have is 1 part in 10 raised to the power of 10, raised in turn again to the power of 123. I would write that out as a percentage, but even if I could change all of the matter in the universe into paper, I would still have far too little paper to print the required number of zeros. In fact, I would need more zeros than there are particles in the universe. Sir Fred Hoyle, the late Cambridge astronomer, one of the 20th century's most significant scientific thinkers, he compared the random emergence of even the simplest cell to a tornado blowing through a junkyard and just happening by chance to produce a perfect Boeing 747 airplane. These are the sorts of odds we're talking about. What explains this incredible precision in the universe? Imagine that by this point in the talk you are unbearably bored. Hard to imagine, I know. You're unbearably bored, and so you break out a deck of cards. You start playing poker with the person sitting next to you. And in the first 12 rounds, they get 12 straight royal flushes. What should you think? How dare you insult your neighbor like that? Yes, of course, they're cheating. Why? Because even if the person sitting next to you is a very honest person, it's so incredibly unlikely to get 12 straight royal flushes just by chance that someone must be messing with the cards. Even if you thought there was only a 1% chance that the person sitting next to you would cheat, if you saw them get dozens upon dozens upon dozens of royal flushes, one after another, you would have no choice but to conclude that someone was carefully arranging the cards. Scientists tell us this is exactly what's going on in our universe. One royal flush after another. Could it be that the evidence warrants the same conclusion? Someone got their hands on the cards and carefully arranged the system. Are you a random collection of genetic letters, or are you a poem that was intentionally and carefully crafted? Are you a sestina? That is the question behind the question of the meaning of life. The Bible says that you are a word, not just a random collection of genetic letters.
When I was studying in the 80s, Flew was the big atheist. You had to read everything Anthony Flew wrote. And as he comes to the tail end of his life, he starts a search for God again. And what does he say? Two things. The moral reasoning we need was not explainable in his naturalistic framework, number one. Number two, he said, if Jesus really rose again from the dead, if I could be convinced of that, that would be the point of reference to transform my own thinking. And he referred to N.T. Wright's book in the Resurrection. He said, C.S. Lewis, with his moral argument, and N.T. Wright, writing on the resurrection, are the two arguments I'm so struggling with and trying desperately to come to terms with. Ladies and gentlemen, that is your struggle and mine too. How do we separate good from evil? How do we know whether we live beyond these 70 years and 10? Those two are the hinges. Let me give you one illustration, give you a last quote and illustration, I'll be done. In 92, I was, I think it was 92, three visits, but one of them was in what is the former Soviet Union now. What was the former Soviet Union, and now all to the balkanized state that we have. A general by the name of Kirshen invited me to speak there. After all these years, I made connection with him in the last month, and he sent me a beautiful letter inviting me to come back and visit. While I was speaking at the military academy there that he invited me to speak at, they were all atheists as professors, all of them, and their questions were pointed, poignant, harsh, tough. My wife on one side, my colleague on the other side. One of the things I shared with them shook them, and the professor and the general and I talked about it again as I went over the story with him. It's so long ago, I forget the sequence in which it happened, but the story that brought him to tears was this. They were trying to defend all of their ideology and all of their philosophy, and I was talking about how atheism ultimately will kill values in a nation. And I told them of Joseph Stalin, how he viewed people. A foreign dignitary had come to visit him and looked at him and said, "How long do you plan to keep torturing your people and think they will follow you?" Stalin never answered the question. He called the waiter and asked him to bring a live chicken to him. Stalin took that chicken, clutched that chicken, and started to defeather that bird. While it was struggling to break free from him, he was denuding it. And finally, completely denuded, while this dignitary was looking on, he took that denuded bird and put it down on the floor, took a piece of bread and walked away. And the chicken hobbled over towards him and nuzzled between his trouser legs. And he bent down with a piece of bread, and the chicken pecked away at it. He said, "Madam, do you have your answer?" He said, "I tortured this chicken. It will follow me for food the rest of its life. People are like that chicken. You torture them, they will follow you for food the rest of their lives." He obliterated 15 million of them. I kid you not, the general's lips began to quiver. And I said to him, "General, your greatest need is the same as my greatest need. I need a heart that needs to be changed so that I will love God and love my fellow human being. You have the need for Jesus Christ to change your heart. He's the only one who's big enough to change it." When you read the story of the younger son going out and squandering all the father's wealth and returning, the younger boy coming home, I come from the East. If I'd taken my portion of the wealth, my dad didn't have much, but if I'd taken it and gone and squandered it and then returned, I know what my dad would have done. Tell him to come right here and fall on his face, and I want to talk to that boy. But the story surprisingly ends in two ways you don't expect. The first is that the father gathers his robes and he runs outside to welcome the son back. That's the grace of God extended in the gospel message, which is very unique. Please hear me now. In every other worldview, salvation is earned. Your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds. Your righteousness has to exceed your unrighteousness. Your karma has to be paid. Only in the gospel message is salvation a gift, the gift of grace, unmerited by you. So the father comes out. The father comes out to receive the son. That's a surprise in the Eastern story. But there's a second surprise. There's an older brother who's pretty upset. He said, "What's this? I've been here all along, and he's the boy who's getting the party. What do I need to do?" You see, he's the one who had never enjoyed the love of the Father, even though he lived under the same roof. He never got to break free from his own selfishness to enjoy the love of the Father. I say to you, to somebody who doesn't want God, even heaven would be hell for that person. Goodness would be an angering thing to the individual. All I can tell you is this: if any man comes unto me, Jesus says, I will in no wise cast him out. You have the opportunity to come to him. If you desire not to be with him, he will second your motion, and that is a choice you make for time and eternity. There's a younger boy who repents. There's an older boy who's in the house but never really enjoys being with the dad. You and I can fall into one of those two categories.